In 1867, 2 years after the end of the Civil War, something extraordinary and disturbing happened in Wilkes County, Georgia. In the rural area near Washington, approximately 15 miles southeast of the county seat, lived an elderly woman named Patience Whitmore. According to the sparse records that survived in the Washington courthouse basement, Patience claimed to have been born in 1768, making her 99 years old at the time these events were documented. What made Patience's case extraordinary was not merely her alleged age, though that alone would have been remarkable for someone born into slavery. It was what she claimed to remember, and more importantly, what she insisted she could still see that troubled the small community of freed slaves and white farmers who knew her. The first official mention of Patience appears in a handwritten report filed by Reverend Moses Franklin, a Baptist minister who had been assigned to minister to the newly freed slave population in the region. Franklin's report, dated July 15, 1867, described his initial encounter with the woman who would become known throughout the county as the one who saw too much. Franklin had been making his rounds through the scattered cabins and settlements where former slaves had established small communities after emancipation. The area around Washington had been home to several large plantations, and many of the freed people had chosen to remain in the vicinity, working as sharecroppers or establishing small farms on land they managed to purchase or lease. It was during one of these visits that Franklin first encountered Patience Whitmore. She lived alone in a cabin approximately 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, situated at the end of a dirt path that wound through a stand of old-growth pines. The cabin itself was unremarkable, a simple one-room structure with a stone chimney and a small garden plot where she grew vegetables and herbs. What struck Franklin immediately was Patience's lucidity and the precision of her memories. Unlike many elderly people he had encountered, her recollections were not vague or confused. She spoke with startling clarity about events that had occurred decades earlier, providing specific dates, names, and details that could be verified through church records and courthouse documents. But it was not her memory of the past that disturbed Franklin. It was her insistence that she could see people and events that no one else could perceive. During his first visit, as they sat on the small porch of her cabin, Patience suddenly stopped mid-conversation and looked toward the tree line. "Master Cornelius is walking the property line again," she said matter-of-factly. "He does that every evening around this time, checking to make sure his boundaries haven't been disturbed." Franklin looked in the direction she indicated, but saw nothing except the dense wall of pine trees. When he gently pointed this out, Patience looked at him with what he later described as a mixture of pity and concern. "You can't see him because you weren't here when the lines were drawn," she explained. "I've been watching these lands for 99 years. I see what was, what is, and sometimes what's coming." The disturbing nature of these claims became more apparent as Franklin continued his visits over the following weeks. Patience would often interrupt conversations to comment on the activities of people who, according to all available evidence, had been dead for decades. She spoke of seeing former overseers making their rounds, plantation owners conducting business meetings, and slaves working in fields that had been abandoned since the war. What made these visions particularly unsettling was their consistency and the historical accuracy of the details Patience provided. Franklin began documenting her statements and cross-referencing them with available records. To his growing unease, many of her descriptions of people and events aligned perfectly with historical documents, even though there was no apparent way she could have accessed such information. In August of 1867, Franklin decided to involve Dr. Samuel Morrison, a physician from Washington who had experience treating both physical and mental ailments. Morrison's initial examination of Patience revealed a woman in remarkable physical health for someone of her alleged age. Her eyesight was sharp, her hearing acute, and her mental faculties appeared completely intact. However, Morrison's report, preserved in the county medical records, noted several peculiarities. Patience's pulse rate was unusually slow, and her body temperature consistently measured below normal. Most remarkably, she showed no signs of the physical deterioration typically associated with extreme old age. Her skin, while weathered, lacked the characteristic thinning and fragility of centenarians. Her hair, though white, remained thick and showed signs of recent growth. When Morrison questioned her about her age and background, Patience provided a detailed account of her life that spanned nearly a full century. She claimed to have been born on the Millwood plantation, owned by the Cornelius family, in 1768. According to her account, she had witnessed the property change hands 3 times, seen numerous generations of both enslaved and free families, and observed the gradual transformation of the landscape from pristine wilderness to cultivated farmland. The Cornelius family records, examined by Franklin and Morrison, confirmed many of the details Patience provided. The Millwood plantation had indeed existed, covering approximately 2,000 acres in the area where Patience now lived. The plantation had been established in the 1760s and had remained in the Cornelius family until 1862, when the last male heir was killed in the Battle of Antietam. What troubled the investigators was not the accuracy of Patience's historical knowledge, but her continued insistence that she could observe the daily activities of people who had been dead for years. She would often describe conversations she claimed to overhear between former plantation owners and their guests, providing details about business transactions, family disputes, and social gatherings that had supposedly taken place decades earlier. During one particularly unsettling visit in September, Patience began describing a scene she claimed to be witnessing in real time. According to her account, she could see a meeting taking place in the main house of the former Millwood plantation, which had been destroyed by fire in 1863. "Master Cornelius is meeting with the overseer about the new field hands," she told Franklin and Morrison. "They're discussing whether to purchase more people from the Charleston market or breed their own stock. The master is concerned about the cost, but the overseer insists they need more workers for the cotton harvest." Franklin and Morrison exchanged uneasy glances. The conversation Patience described matched almost exactly a discussion documented in letters found in the Cornelius family papers, correspondence that had been sealed in the courthouse vault since the plantation's dissolution and would not be made public for decades. As word of Patience's unusual abilities spread through the community, she began receiving visitors from across Wilkes County and beyond. Some came out of curiosity, others seeking information about deceased relatives or lost property. Local newspaper coverage, though limited, helped spread awareness of the case beyond the immediate area. The Washington Gazette published a brief article in October 1867 describing Patience as a remarkable woman of advanced age who possesses an extraordinary memory for historical events and an unsettling ability to describe occurrences that others cannot observe. The article noted that several prominent citizens had visited Patience and confirmed the accuracy of her historical recollections. However, not everyone in the community viewed Patience's abilities with benign curiosity. Some of the white residents, particularly those whose families had owned plantations in the area, became increasingly uncomfortable with her detailed knowledge of past events. There were whispered concerns about what else she might know, what secrets from the slavery era she might be able to reveal. In November, Franklin's reports began to take on a more urgent tone. He noted that Patience had begun describing events that were supposedly taking place in locations throughout the county, not just on the former Millwood plantation. She spoke of seeing former slaves who had died years earlier still working in fields, former masters conducting business in buildings that no longer existed, and overseas making rounds through properties that had been subdivided and sold to new owners. More disturbing were her occasional references to events that she claimed had not yet occurred but would happen soon. These predictions were vague and often difficult to interpret, but they added another layer of unease to an already unsettling situation. Dr. Morrison's follow-up examinations revealed no change in Patience's physical condition. If anything, she appeared to be growing stronger rather than weaker. Her weight had increased slightly, her color had improved, and she showed no signs of the mental confusion that typically accompanies extreme old age. The mystery deepened when Morrison decided to investigate Patience's claims about her birth and early life more thoroughly. Working with Franklin and a local attorney named James Hutchinson, he began examining available records to verify her story. The search proved frustrating. While the Cornelius family papers contained extensive records of slave purchases, births, and deaths, there was no specific mention of a slave named Patience, born in 1768. The records from that period were incomplete, but what survived suggested that any slave born on the plantation that year would have been documented. More puzzling was the absence of any record of Patience's presence in the area during the decades following emancipation. The Freedmen's Bureau records, while not comprehensive, contain no mention of her receiving assistance or registering for any of the programs established to help former slaves transition to freedom. It was as if Patience Whitmore had simply materialized in 1867, fully formed and carrying with her nearly a century of memories that could not be verified through conventional means. In December, Franklin made a discovery that would alter the direction of the investigation entirely. While examining church records in the basement of the Washington Baptist Church, he found a reference to a slave named Patience, who had been buried in the plantation cemetery of the Millwood estate in 1837. The burial record, written in the careful script of the plantation overseer, described the death of Patience, aged approximately 70 years, faithful servant of the Cornelius family for the entirety of her life. According to the record, she had died of what appeared to be natural causes related to her advanced age. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If the burial record was accurate, then the woman claiming to be Patience Whitmore had been dead for 30 years. Yet the living Patience knew details about events that had occurred after 1837, including the plantation's final years and the circumstances of its dissolution during the Civil War. Franklin brought this information to Dr. Morrison and James Hutchinson, and the three men agreed to confront Patience with their findings. The meeting took place on December 20th, 1867, in Patience's cabin, with all three men present as witnesses. When presented with the burial record, Patience examined it carefully and nodded slowly. "That was my grandmother," she said quietly. "We shared the same name. She told me before she passed that I would need to carry her memories as well as my own." The explanation was logical, but it raised more questions than it answered. If the woman in the cemetery was Patience's grandmother, why had there been no record of a granddaughter with the same name? And how could the current Patience know such intimate details about events that had occurred throughout the plantation's history, including periods before her alleged birth? Morrison decided to conduct a more thorough physical examination, looking for any clues that might explain Patience's apparent longevity and unusual abilities. What he discovered would be documented in a confidential report that would not be made public until the county medical records were transferred to the state archives in 1962. The examination revealed several anomalies that Morrison could not explain using the medical knowledge available to him in 1867. Patience's muscle tone and bone density were consistent with those of a woman perhaps 40 years younger. Her teeth, while showing signs of wear, were in remarkably good condition for someone of any age. Most puzzling, several of her internal organs appeared to be functioning at levels typically associated with much younger individuals. Morrison also noted what he described as unusual scarring patterns on patients' back and arms. The scars were old, clearly dating back many years, but their configuration was unlike anything he had seen before. They formed intricate patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their design, as if they had been created according to some specific plan rather than resulting from random injury or punishment. When Morrison questioned patients about the scars, she became evasive for the first time since the investigation began. She would only say that they were marks of remembering and that they helped her see across time. She refused to provide any additional details, despite repeated questioning. As 1867 drew to a close, the case of Patience Whitmore had attracted attention from as far away as Atlanta and Savannah. Several newspaper reporters made the journey to Wilkes County to interview the mysterious centenarian, and their articles helped spread awareness of the case throughout Georgia and beyond. However, not all of the attention was welcome. In January 1868, Franklin received a visit from two men who identified themselves as representatives of certain interested parties who preferred to remain anonymous. They expressed concern about the publicity surrounding Patience's case and suggested that it might be wise to discourage further investigation. The men were polite but firm in their request. They pointed out that some of the historical events Patience described involved families that still had significant influence in the region. They suggested that continued excavation of the past might prove embarrassing or even damaging to people who had no connection to the activities of their ancestors. Franklin found the visit deeply troubling, particularly given the implied threats underlying the polite language. He shared his concerns with Morrison and Hutchinson, and the three men agreed to continue their investigation while taking appropriate precautions. It was during this period of heightened tension that Patience began describing what she called the Watchers. According to her account, she had become aware of people observing her cabin from the surrounding woods, individuals who seemed to appear and disappear without warning. Franklin and Morrison initially dismissed these reports as paranoia brought on by the stress of constant attention. However, their skepticism was shaken when they themselves began to notice signs of surveillance during their visits to Patience's cabin. On several occasions, they observed movement in the tree line that could not be attributed to wildlife. Fresh footprints were found around the cabin's perimeter, and Morrison reported the unsettling sensation of being watched during his examinations of Patience. The situation escalated in February when Franklin discovered that his room at the local boarding house had been searched during one of his visits to Patience. Nothing appeared to be missing, but his notes and documents had clearly been examined and rearranged. These developments convinced the three investigators that their work was being monitored by individuals who had a strong interest in preventing further investigation of Patience's case. However, rather than deterring them, the interference only strengthened their resolve to uncover the truth. It was Morrison who suggested a different approach to understanding Patience's abilities. Rather than focusing solely on the historical accuracy of her visions, he proposed that they examine the locations she claimed to be observing to see if there might be some physical explanation for her unusual perceptions. The investigation of the former Millwood Plantation site proved to be a turning point in the case. The main house had been destroyed by fire in 1863, but the foundation stones remained, along with the ruins of several outbuildings. The slave quarters had been demolished after emancipation, but their locations were still marked by differences in vegetation and soil composition. When Franklin and Morrison brought Patience to the site in March 1868, her reactions were immediate and dramatic. She began describing the layout of buildings that no longer existed, pointing to specific locations where she claimed to see structures that had been destroyed years earlier. More significantly, she led them to a location near the former slave quarters, where she insisted that something important was buried. Despite their initial skepticism, Franklin and Morrison decided to excavate the site, working carefully to avoid damaging any artifacts they might uncover. What they found beneath 3 feet of soil and accumulated debris would change their understanding of the case entirely. The excavation revealed a collection of objects that appeared to be of African origin, including carved wooden figures, metal implements of unknown purpose, and a collection of small stones arranged in specific patterns. Among the artifacts was a leather-bound journal written in a mixture of English and what appeared to be several African languages. One passage, translated with the help of a scholar from the University of Georgia who specialized in African languages, described a ceremony designed to allow the bearer of memories to witness across the spans of time, seeing what was and what continues to be, until the burden is passed to another who is worthy of the site. The journal appeared to belong to someone named Kwame, who identified himself as a practitioner of traditional spiritual arts who had been brought to the Millwood plantation from the Gold Coast of Africa in the late 1700s. The handwriting was cramped and difficult to decipher, but the legible portions described rituals and practices that seemed to be related to maintaining connections between the living and the dead. According to the journal entries, Kwame had taught these practices to select individuals among the enslaved population, including a woman named Patience. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If the journal was authentic, it suggested that Patience's abilities might be the result of specific training in African spiritual practices that had been preserved and passed down through generations of enslaved people. However, the journal also contained warnings about the dangers of such practices. Several entries described individuals who had been consumed by the sight and had lost the ability to distinguish between past and present, living and dead. The journal suggested that these abilities came with a significant cost, and that those who possessed them often paid a heavy price for their expanded perception. When Franklin and Morrison showed Patience the artifacts they had discovered, her reaction was immediate and intense. She examined each object carefully, handling them with obvious familiarity and reverence. When she came to the journal, she opened it to specific pages and began reading passages aloud in languages that neither Franklin nor Morrison recognized. "Kwame was my teacher," she explained when they asked about the journal. "He taught me to see across time when I was still young, but he warned me that the sight would grow stronger as I aged, and that eventually it might become too strong for one person to bear." This revelation provided a potential explanation for Patience's unusual abilities, but it also raised new and disturbing questions. If she had indeed been trained in these practices as a young woman in the late 1800s, how had she managed to conceal her abilities for so long? And why had they only become apparent to others in recent months? Patience's answer to these questions was both illuminating and deeply unsettling. According to her account, she had indeed been hiding her abilities for most of her life, understanding instinctively that they would be misunderstood or feared by both white and black communities. However, she explained, the abilities had been growing stronger in recent years, making it increasingly difficult for her to distinguish between what she was seeing in the present and what she was witnessing from the past. The visions had become so vivid and constant that she had begun commenting on them without realizing that others could not see what she was experiencing. "The sight has been bleeding through," she told Franklin and Morrison. "What I see from before is becoming as real as what I see now. Soon, I fear, I won't be able to tell the difference at all." This explanation provided context for the reports of Patience's declining ability to maintain normal conversations and her increasing tendency to respond to people and situations that existed only in her visions. Several visitors had noted that she would sometimes appear to be listening to conversations that no one else could hear, or would respond to questions that hadn't been asked. Dr. Morrison's medical examinations during this period began to reveal changes in Patience's condition that corresponded with her own descriptions of her deteriorating ability to anchor herself in the present. Her pulse rate, previously unusually slow, had become irregular. Her body temperature fluctuated unpredictably. Most concerning, she began to show signs of physical fatigue that seemed disproportionate to her activities. The discovery of the artifacts and journal also attracted unwanted attention from the same mysterious individuals who had been monitoring the investigation. In April 1868, Franklin's boarding house room was searched again, this time more thoroughly and with less concern for concealing the intrusion. More seriously, Morrison reported that his medical practice was being investigated by individuals claiming to represent state medical authorities. While no formal charges were brought against him, the scrutiny made it clear that powerful interests wanted the investigation of Patience's case to cease. The pressure intensified when James Hutchinson received a visit from representatives of several prominent families in the region. They made it clear that continued investigation of historical events related to the slavery period was unwelcome and could have serious consequences for anyone involved. Despite these warnings, the three investigators continued their work, driven by a combination of scientific curiosity and genuine concern for Patience's welfare. However, they agreed to be more discreet in their activities and to limit the documentation they kept of their findings. It was during this period of increased caution that Patience began describing what she called the final gathering. According to her account, she was witnessing preparations for some kind of ceremony or event that involved both the living and the dead. She spoke of seeing figures from throughout the plantation's history converging on the site where the artifacts had been buried. These visions appeared to cause Patience significant distress. She would often become agitated while describing them, claiming that she could hear voices calling to her and feel pressure to participate in activities that she couldn't fully understand. Franklin and Morrison became increasingly concerned about Patience's mental and physical state as these visions intensified. She began to lose weight despite maintaining her appetite, and her sleep patterns became severely disrupted. Most alarming, she began to show signs of dissociation, sometimes appearing to be completely unaware of her present surroundings while engaged in detailed conversations with people who weren't there. In May 1868, Patience's condition reached a crisis point. During a visit from Franklin and Morrison, she suddenly became catatonic, staring fixedly at a point in the distance and refusing to respond to questions or physical contact. This state lasted for nearly 6 hours before she suddenly returned to normal consciousness, with no memory of the episode. When questioned about her experience during the catatonic period, Patience could only say that she had been called to witness the final ceremony and had found herself observing events that she described as the settling of all debts and the release of all bonds. Dr. Morrison's examination following this episode revealed significant changes in Patience's vital signs and neurological responses. Her reflexes were delayed, her pupils responded abnormally to light, and she showed signs of what he described as disconnection from immediate sensory input. Most disturbing was Morrison's discovery that Patience's body temperature had dropped to levels that should have been fatal. Yet she showed no signs of hypothermia or other symptoms typically associated with such extreme temperature reduction. It was as if her body was operating according to different physiological rules than those governing normal human function. The crisis deepened when patients began to speak in languages that none of the investigators recognized. These episodes would last for hours, during which she would carry on animated conversations with unseen participants, gesturing and reacting as if engaged in complex social interactions. During one such episode, Franklin managed to record portions of these conversations using a newly acquired Edison phonograph. When the recordings were later analyzed by linguistic experts, they were found to contain elements of several West African languages, some of which had not been spoken in North America for over a century. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If Patience was indeed speaking authentic African languages that had been extinct in the American South for decades, it provided strong evidence that her visions were somehow accessing genuine historical memories rather than being products of mental illness or deliberate deception. However, the recordings also contained elements that the linguistic experts could not identify, suggesting that Patience might be speaking in languages or dialects that had been lost entirely or perhaps never existed in any conventional sense. As Patience's condition continued to deteriorate throughout the summer of 1868, Franklin and Morrison found themselves facing an impossible situation. They had documented extraordinary phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about human consciousness and perception, but they had no framework for understanding or treating what they were observing. The situation was further complicated by the increasing pressure from unknown sources to abandon their investigation. In June, Franklin received a formal complaint from church authorities questioning his continued involvement with what they termed inappropriate spiritual practices. While no official action was taken against him, the warning was clear. Morrison faced similar pressure from medical colleagues who expressed concern about his association with what they viewed as superstitious nonsense that reflected poorly on the profession. Several prominent physicians in the region publicly criticized his continued documentation of Patience's case. Despite these challenges, both men remained committed to understanding and helping Patience. They had witnessed phenomena that defied conventional explanation and felt a scientific and moral obligation to continue their investigation. In July, their persistence was rewarded with a breakthrough that would provide crucial insight into Patience's condition. While examining the artifacts discovered at the plantation site more carefully, Morrison noticed that several of the carved wooden figures showed signs of recent handling, despite having been buried for decades. When he mentioned this observation to Patience, she confirmed that she had been visiting the burial site regularly, drawn by what she described as the calling of the guardians. According to her account, the artifacts were not merely historical objects, but active spiritual tools that maintained their connection to the practices for which they had been created. This revelation led Morrison and Franklin to a disturbing conclusion. Patience's deteriorating condition might be the result of her interaction with forces or energies associated with the buried artifacts. If the journal's warnings about the dangers of these practices were accurate, she might be experiencing the consumption by the sight that it described. The question then became whether anything could be done to help her, or whether they were witnessing an irreversible process that would ultimately lead to her complete disconnection from present reality. In August 1868, Patience provided what would prove to be a crucial piece of information about her condition. During one of her increasingly rare periods of lucidity, she told Franklin and Morrison that the artifacts were calling her to complete the circle, and that she felt compelled to perform a final ceremony that would close the door between what was and what is. According to her explanation, the practices taught by Kwame were designed to be passed from one generation to another, with each practitioner eventually transferring their accumulated knowledge and abilities to a chosen successor. The problem in her case was that she had never found someone suitable to receive this transfer. "I've carried these memories and this sight for too long," she explained. They were meant to be shared, not hoarded by one person. The weight of all that seeing is crushing me, but I can't let go until I find someone who can bear it properly. This revelation provided a potential explanation for Patience's deteriorating condition and suggested a possible solution. If the practices required the transfer of abilities from one person to another, then her isolation might be preventing the natural progression that would allow her to release the burden she carried. However, finding someone suitable for such a transfer presented obvious challenges. The practices involved were clearly dangerous, and it would be ethically questionable to expose another person to the risks that Patience was experiencing. Nevertheless, Franklin and Morrison began to explore the possibility that they might be able to find someone who could at least provide temporary relief for Patience's condition. They started by examining the journal more carefully to understand the requirements for such a transfer. According to the journal, the ideal recipient for these abilities was someone who already possessed natural sensitivity to spiritual phenomena and who had been prepared through specific training and rituals. The journal also emphasized that the transfer should be voluntary and that the recipient must fully understand the responsibilities and risks involved. In September, their search led them to an unexpected candidate. Sarah Williams was a 45-year-old woman who had been born into slavery on a plantation approximately 20 miles from the Millwood estate. Since emancipation, she had worked as a midwife and healer, serving the African-American communities throughout Wilkes County. What made Sarah potentially suitable for the role was her reputation for possessing what locals called the sight. She was known for her ability to predict difficult births, locate lost objects, and provide guidance during times of crisis. Several people had mentioned that she seemed to know things that hadn't been told to her directly. When Franklin and Morrison approached Sarah about Patience's situation, they were surprised to discover that she was already aware of the case and had been considering how she might be able to help. According to Sarah, she had been experiencing unusual dreams and visions related to Patience for several months. "I've been seeing an old woman calling for help from across the years," Sarah told them. "She's carrying too much history, and it's breaking her spirit. I've been waiting for someone to ask me to help, but I wasn't sure how to offer." Sarah's willingness to assist, combined with her apparent natural abilities, made her a logical candidate for attempting the transfer that Patience described. However, all involved understood that they were entering completely uncharted territory with potentially serious consequences. The decision to proceed was made more urgent by Patience's rapidly declining condition. By October 1868, she was spending most of her time in a state that could only be described as temporal displacement. She would carry on detailed conversations about events from decades earlier as if they were happening in real time, while showing little awareness of her immediate surroundings. Dr. Morrison's examinations during this period revealed that Patience's vital signs continued to weaken despite the absence of any identifiable disease or injury. It was becoming clear that whatever was happening to her was progressing towards some kind of resolution, whether that meant recovery or something more final. The ceremony that Patience had described as necessary for completing the circle was scheduled for November 15th, 1868. The date was chosen based on Patience's insistence that it coincided with what she called the anniversary of the first teaching, presumably referring to when Kwame had originally shared these practices with the enslaved community at Millwood Plantation. Preparation for the ceremony involved several weeks of consultation between Patience, Sarah, and the journal writings. Despite her deteriorating condition, Patience remained lucid enough to provide detailed instructions about the rituals and precautions that would be necessary. According to her guidance, the ceremony would involve the transfer of what she called the burden of sight from herself to Sarah. This transfer would theoretically allow patients to release the accumulated memories and visions that were overwhelming her consciousness, while providing Sarah with enhanced abilities to serve her community. However, patients also warned that the transfer carried significant risks for both participants. For herself, the process might result in complete loss of the abilities that had defined her existence for decades, potentially leaving her disoriented and unable to function normally. For Sarah, accepting the transfer would mean taking on responsibilities and perceptions that could fundamentally alter her understanding of reality. On the evening of November 14th, Franklin and Morrison made their final preparations to document what they hoped would be Patience's recovery. They arranged for the Edison phonograph to record the ceremony and gathered materials to preserve any artifacts or writings that might be produced. The ceremony itself took place at the site where the original artifacts had been buried, with Patience and Sarah surrounded by the carved figures and other objects that Kwame had left behind. Franklin and Morrison observed from a respectful distance, taking notes but avoiding any interference with the proceedings. What they witnessed over the following 6 hours challenged their understanding of human consciousness and the nature of reality itself. The ceremony involved elements of African spiritual practices that neither man had encountered before, including chanting, ritual movements, and the manipulation of objects in ways that seemed to produce measurable effects on the environment. Most remarkably, both Patience and Sarah appeared to enter altered states of consciousness, during which they spoke in the same unidentified languages that Patience had been using during her episodes. However, unlike Patience's previous disconnected rambling, these conversations appeared to be coherent exchanges with specific purposes and outcomes. As the ceremony progressed, observable changes occurred in both women. Patience, who had appeared frail and disoriented for months, began to show increased vitality and awareness of her surroundings. Meanwhile, Sarah exhibited signs of the temporal displacement that had been afflicting Patience, occasionally responding to stimuli that weren't present or commenting on events that appeared to be taking place in other time periods. The climax of the ceremony occurred just before dawn, when both women simultaneously collapsed and remained unconscious for nearly an hour. When they finally awakened, the transformation appeared to be complete. Patience showed no signs of the visions that had been tormenting her, while Sarah demonstrated the same ability to perceive historical events that had characterized Patience's condition. However, there was one crucial difference. Unlike Patience, Sarah appeared to maintain control over her abilities, experiencing the visions as discrete episodes rather than constant, overwhelming input. She could describe what she was seeing from the past while remaining fully aware of present circumstances. Dr. Morrison's examination of both women following the ceremony revealed that the physical anomalies that had characterized Patience's condition had transferred to Sarah. Sarah's vital signs now showed the same irregularities that Patience had exhibited, while Patience's readings had returned to normal ranges for a woman of her age. More significantly, Patience appeared to have lost much of the detailed historical knowledge that had made her case so remarkable. When questioned about events from the plantation's past, she could provide only general recollections, rather than the precise details that had previously amazed investigators. The success of the transfer ceremony provided answers to some of the questions surrounding Patience's case, while raising new ones about the nature of consciousness and memory. It appeared that the abilities documented in Kwame's journal were indeed transferable, and that they operated according to principles that conventional medical and scientific knowledge could not explain. However, the ceremony also marked the end of Patience's usefulness as a source of historical information. With the transfer complete, she became simply an elderly woman with ordinary memories and perceptions. The remarkable witness to a century of Southern history had effectively ceased to exist, In December 1868, Franklin submitted his final report on the Patience Whitmore case to church authorities. The report carefully documented the historical information that had been gathered, while omitting any detailed discussion of the supernatural elements involved. Church officials filed the report without comment and made no effort to pursue further investigation. Dr. Morrison's medical records were sealed and deposited in the county courthouse vault, where they would remain undisturbed for nearly a century. The official explanation for Patience's unusual condition was recorded as age-related mental deterioration with occasional periods of historical confusion. James Hutchinson, the attorney who had assisted with the legal aspects of the investigation, destroyed most of his notes related to the case and advised his colleagues to avoid any involvement with similar matters. The artifacts discovered at the plantation site were reburied at Sarah's request, and their location was never officially recorded. Patience Whitmore lived for 3 more years following the ceremony, dying peacefully in her sleep in February 1871, at what was recorded as the age of 103. Her funeral was attended by several dozen members of the local African-American community, but there was no mention of the remarkable abilities that had once made her famous throughout the region. Sarah Williams continued to serve as a midwife and healer until her death in 1892. Those who knew her noted that she possessed an unusual ability to provide comfort and guidance during difficult times, but she never publicly discussed the source of her insights or the events of November 1868. The records of the Patience Whitmore case remained buried in various archives until 1962, when a graduate student researching post-Civil War African-American communities discovered Franklin's report in the basement of a church that was being demolished. This discovery led to the gradual assembly of documents related to the case from courthouse records, medical files, and private collections. However, by the time these documents were assembled and analyzed, all of the original participants were long dead, and the locations mentioned in the reports had been significantly altered by development and natural changes. Attempts to locate the burial site of Kwame's artifacts proved unsuccessful, as did efforts to trace descendants of the people involved in the case. The most recent examination of the available evidence took place in 1967, exactly 100 years after the events were first documented. A team of historians and anthropologists from the University of Georgia conducted an extensive review of all available materials and attempted to verify the historical claims made in the various reports. Their conclusion, published in a limited circulation academic journal, was that the Patience Whitmore case represented a fascinating example of how oral tradition and cultural memory could be preserved within African-American communities despite the disruptions of slavery and emancipation. They theorized that Patience had somehow gained access to detailed historical information through informal networks of community elders, and had developed an unusual ability to present this information in a compelling narrative format. The academic review made no attempt to address the supernatural elements documented in the original reports, dismissing them as products of the limited scientific understanding available in the 1860s. However, several of the researchers noted privately that some aspects of the case remained difficult to explain using conventional historical and psychological frameworks. Today, the Patience Whitmore case exists primarily as a footnote in the academic literature dealing with post-Civil War Southern history. The original documents are housed in various archives throughout Georgia, available to researchers who know how to find them, but rarely consulted, except by specialists in African-American history or folklore studies. The cabin where Patience lived has long since disappeared, replaced by a modern subdivision that shows no trace of the events that once took place there. The Millwood Plantation site is now part of a state park, with historical markers that make no mention of Patience Whitmore or the artifacts that were discovered and reburied there. Yet occasionally, park visitors report unusual experiences while walking the trails that cross the former plantation grounds. Some describe hearing voices speaking in unfamiliar languages or glimpsing figures moving through the trees who disappear when approached directly. Park rangers have learned to dismiss such reports as products of imagination or the natural sounds and shadows of the forest. But among the African American communities of Wilkes County, there are still those who remember the stories passed down from grandparents and great-grandparents about the woman who could see across time. These stories are rarely shared with outsiders, but they persist as part of the oral tradition that connects current residents to their ancestors who lived through slavery and its aftermath. Sometimes, during quiet evenings, when families gather to share memories and maintain connections to their past, someone will mention hearing about an old woman who carried the memories of everyone who had gone before. The stories vary in detail, but they consistently describe someone who bore witness to history and carried that burden until she could pass it on to someone else who was worthy of the responsibility. These contemporary accounts suggest that the practices documented in Kwame's journal may have survived in some form, passed down through generations of practitioners who understood the importance of preserving cultural memory while adapting to changing circumstances. Whether these modern inheritors possess abilities similar to those displayed by Patience Whitmore remains unknown, but the persistence of the stories suggests that the tradition she represented continues to influence the communities she once served.